In October of 1968, a man sat behind a desk inside an advertising office in downtown Detroit, Michigan. He ran the company as though it had always been his own. He signed the checks, took meetings, and kept the firm's small arts and culture magazine in print. To anyone walking past the door, it was simply his office, his business, and his life. But it wasn't. The man who had built all of it was called Richard Robison, and he'd been dead since June, along with his wife Shirley and their 4 children. They were shot inside the family summer cottage on the Lake Michigan shore, all 6 of them in a single evening. And the man now occupying his chair and drawing on his accounts was the same man the Michigan State Police already believed had killed every one of them. That is not the twist this story builds towards. That is where the story has to begin, because everything strange about the Robison case lives inside that single image. A suspected killer, comfortable, unbothered, and sitting in the dead man's seat. The murders were filed, and to this day, the case is considered one of America's greatest unsolved crimes. But the word is misleading, because the people who actually worked the case settled on a single suspect within 2 weeks and never moved off him. They built a report 700 pages long that named him outright, but what they never built was a prosecution. So this is less the account of a crime that couldn't be solved than of a man who was never made to answer for it, and who spent the years that followed living inside the very life that he stood accused of destroying. This is the story of the Robison family murders. A husband, a wife, and their 4 children who drove north for the summer and never came home. Most retellings move through this case in order: the idyllic summer result, the long silence, the terrible discovery, and at the end, the open question, left hanging like an accusation against no one in particular. Told that way, it feels like a puzzle with a missing piece. But it was never really missing. The piece had a name, an address, and eventually a 700-page file. So the family has to come first, because the case is meaningless without them. Then the man, then the money, the evidence, and finally, the silence that let him walk. Richard Robison was 42, and by any ordinary measure, he'd built a good life. He married Shirley Fulton in 1947, and by the mid-1950s, he was running his own advertising agency in the Detroit suburbs and publishing a cultural magazine called Impresario. The family lived in the affluent suburb of Lathrop Village, owned a private plane, and were by every surviving account an almost pointedly wholesome household, church-going, close, the kind of family that always did things together. There were 6 of them, Richard and Shirley and their 4 children. Richard Jr. was 19 and home from Eastern Michigan University. Gary was 16. Randall, who everyone called Randy, was 12. And Susan, their youngest, was 7, in 1st grade, and by every account completely horse mad. Those small details matter because the case has a habit of reducing them to a number: 6 victims. In the 1950s, the family bought a holiday cottage near a tiny settlement called Good Hart on the northwest shoulder of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. They named it Somerset. It had 5 rooms, built from log and stone, and was set at the end of a long private drive in heavy woods, near a place where the land falls 100 feet to Lake Michigan. From the road, the cottage was nearly invisible. And that near invisibility is not atmosphere, it's evidence. Whoever came for this family in June of 1968 was not a stranger who stumbled upon an unmarked drive. He knew exactly where they were and exactly how to find a house almost no one else could. To carry the thesis, the case needs one more person, and he is the reason the case exists at all. His name was Joseph Scolaro. He was 30 years old, a Harvard graduate, a veteran of the Army Security Agency, and Richard Robison's right hand. He'd worked for the company since the end of 1965, risen quickly, and earned enough of his employer's trust that when the family went north for the summer, Robison left him in charge of the entire operation, both the agency and the magazine. Scolaro had been to the Somerset cottage before. He knew the long hidden drive, and in fact, he knew something else that Robison didn't know he knew, which was the precise state of the company's finances. Because beneath the wholesome surface of the Robison story, money had been quietly disappearing. When investigators later opened the books, the picture was not ambiguous. In the months before the murders, someone had been raising his own salary and expenses without the owner's knowledge. There was clear forgery on the company checks. The later accounting could not trace where more than $60,000 had gone. And in 1968, that was a fortune. The trail didn't wander. It led to the one man who had been handed the keys to everything. The thesis of this case turns on a single morning, and that morning did not begin at the cottage. It began on the telephone. On the 25th of June 1968, Richard Robison called his banker in Detroit to ask about a large deposit he was expecting, somewhere around $200,000. But the banker told him that it hadn't arrived, that there had been irregularities in the business account, and that the balance of the company Robison had spent a decade building stood at roughly $15,000. Reportedly, Robison was not confused. He was furious, and he knew exactly who to call. According to the telephone records investigators reconstructed afterwards, over the hours that followed, Robison called or attempted to call Joseph Scolaro 17 times. A man on vacation, more than 200 miles from his office, dialing again and again to reach the one person who could account for the hole in his accounts. The office receptionist later told the police that Scolaro had taken the first furious call and then had left the office abruptly. That is the last clear image of Richard Robison alive, a successful man on the phone, enraged, chasing an answer he would never receive. By that evening, he and his entire family were dead. It's worth pausing here before the evidence accumulates on the question the rest of this video is really about. Not whether there is a possible motive, there obviously is. The question is what a confident answer is worth when no one is ever made to stand behind it. Hold on to that question as the file fills in. So the shape of it was visible almost immediately. A man discovers he has been robbed, confronts the only person with access to the money, and with hours, that man and his entire family are gone. Investigators saw the shape too. But seeing a shape and proving it in a courtroom are not the same act, and the gap between them is exactly where this case would eventually fall. What happened inside the cottage that evening had to be reconstructed from the physical evidence, since no one survived to describe the scene of events. The shooting began outside. Several rounds from a .22 caliber rifle were fired through a rear window at Richard Robison as he sat in a chair. 12-year-old Randy was killed in that same opening burst. The shooter then entered through an unlocked door and killed the remaining 4 with a rifle and a .25 caliber pistol. The 2 older boys appeared to have been among the last, possibly shot as they tried to reach a rifle kept in a back bedroom closet. 2 of the victims were also struck with a hammer. There was almost no sign of a struggle, and 15 spent casings were left on the floor. That is as far into that room as this account needs to go. What the killer did afterward is the part that reveals him. He didn't flee. He moved through the cottage and drew every curtain. Then he covered the bullet holes in the rear window with a square of cardboard. Then he turned the furnace on in the last week of June and locked the door behind him. The furnace is the coldest detail in the entire file. In a sealed summer cottage, heat does one thing: it accelerates everything. Whoever set that thermostat understood precisely what it would do to the evidence and precisely what it would purchase. Time. It purchased 27 days. The 2 cars sat in the drive. A note the family left stayed pinned on the door. And friends and neighbours had been told the Robisons were leaving on a trip, so a dark and silent cottage alarmed no one. The caretaker even noticed an odour in early July, saw the holes in the window and assumed the boys had been careless with pellet guns, so he didn't go inside. It took a neighbour's complaint about the smell to finally force the door on the 22nd of July, nearly a month after the killings. By then, the heat had done everything it had been left on to do. Most true crime stories at this point describe an investigation failing for years against dead ends. But this one didn't. And that absence of failing is the strongest support the thesis has. Within roughly 2 weeks, the Michigan State Police and the Emmett County authorities had settled on Joseph Scolaro and never seriously looked elsewhere again. The reasons accumulated quickly, and they accumulated in one direction. His alibi failed first. For the hours that mattered on the day of the murders, from mid-morning until late at night, not a single person could place Joseph Scolaro anywhere. The accounts he later offered were checked, and they came apart. Then there were the weapons. The murders were committed with a .25 caliber Beretta pistol and an uncommon .22 caliber rifle, known as an AR-7. Scolaro owned two .22 rifles, and he also brought two .25 pistols on the 2nd of February 1968, of the exact make and model used to kill the family. His own wife confirmed she had been with him when he brought them. When confronted, he claimed he had given all of them away months earlier. One rifle was traced to a man in Chicago and tested. It was the right model, but the wrong gun. The other rifle, the one that might have been the murder weapon, was never found. He also failed a polygraph, failed a second, and a third one was ruled inconclusive, with examiners noting that he seemed to be attempting to deceive them even during preliminary questions. And then there was the evidence he couldn't talk his way around. In November of 1969, acting on a tip from Scolaro's own brother-in-law, police searched a private firing range owned by Scolaro's father-in-law. In the dirt, they recovered spent shell casings, and the crime laboratory matched them to the actual AR-7 rifle used in the murder of the Robison family. The gun itself was gone, but the brass it had fired on a range belonging to Scolaro's relatives all lined up. There was even ammunition. Some of the cartridges at the scene were a rare Finnish brand sold in Michigan for only a couple of months in early 1968, and Scolaro had brought it the same day he brought the pistols. By December of 1969, the investigators believed it was finished. They handed prosecutors a report 700 pages long, naming Joseph Scolaro as the sole killer and laying out his means, his motive, and his opportunity. One of them, the detective Lloyd Stearns, would later say that he told Scolaro to his face that he knew that he'd killed the Robisons. If he hadn't, then he knew who pulled the trigger. The case, in other words, was made. But what happened to it next is the reason there is still an argument. In January of 1970, the Emmett County prosecutor Donald Noggle, together with State Attorney General Frank Kelly, declined to bring charges. Their stated reasoning deserves to be presented at its strongest, because it's not absurd. The two actual murder weapons had never been recovered, and no physical evidence had placed Scolaro inside the cottage at the moment of the killings. No fingerprint, nothing. The casings on a relative's firing range were powerful, but powerful and circumstantial are not the same as a weapon in an evidence bag. A prosecutor staring at a possible acquittal in a case this size could easily talk himself into caution. That is the charitable reading. The less charitable readings have followed the case ever since. That a small rural county could not absorb the cost of a long, high-profile murder trial. That Noggle, appointed barely a year earlier and having never tried a murder, did not want his first to be this one. None of these have ever been confirmed, and the absence of a clean explanation is part of what has kept the case unsettled for so long. Honesty also requires noting the alternatives, even briefly, because a case this strange attracts them. One theory points at the caretaker who found the bodies, whose own teenage son had died days earlier in a motorcycle crash. But Richard Robison had personally gone to comfort that grieving father shortly before his own death, which sits oddly inside a revenge story. Another tries to connect the killings to John Norman Collins, the convicted Michigan murderer, on the thread that he and Richard Jr. may have overlapped at university. It's a striking idea, with essentially no evidence behind it, and the investigators never supported it. There is also one genuine loose end the case never closed. A couple staying nearby reported hearing shouting that afternoon, what sounded like two men and a woman, then gunfire. The official reconstruction, built on a single bloody footprint, concluded one person acted alone. Whether Scolaro had help has never been answered, but every alternative raised and examined was set back down, and each time the file returns to the same name. This is where the thesis becomes something harder than an argument about evidence. Because of what Joseph Scolaro did with the years the decision gave him. Within 4 months of the murders, he brought R.C. Robison's and Associates and the magazine out of the dead family's estate, and he moved into Richard Robison's office. The man the entire investigation regarded as a 6-time killer spent the next several years running the company of the people he was accused of killing, from the chair that opened this video. For 3 years, that was where the case rested. Then in 1972, a newly elected prosecutor in neighbouring Oakland County, L. Brooks Patterson, reviewed the file and decided it could be charged in his jurisdiction, and told his assistants simply that they were going to charge Scolaro with murder. The decision made headlines across the state. Then, on the 8th of March 1973, before any charge could reach him, Joseph Scolaro shot himself in his Southfield office. He was 34 years old. He left 2 typewritten notes to his mother, confessing in plain terms that he was a liar, a cheat, and a forger who had defrauded nearly everyone in his life. And at the very bottom, in his own hand, he added a line about the one thing the state was about to charge him with. He had nothing to do with the Robisons, he wrote. He was a cheat, but not a murderer. His death ended the prosecution. A dead man cannot be tried. And because Michigan laws do not permit an open murder case to be formally closed, the Robison murders remain, on paper, unsolved to this day. The calibration matters here, because full certainty would be its own failure. Joseph Scolaro was never charged and never tried. He denied the murders in what may have been his final written words. And the question of whether he acted alone was never resolved. What can be said, and what the evidence supports by a wide margin, is that he is the most evidence-supported answer this case has ever produced, and that the people who spent years inside the file were unanimous about him in a way investigators rarely are. Solved in the sense those investigators meant it. Never proven in the only place that counts. The gap is what the word unsolved has quietly concealed for more than 50 years. And the gap had a cost, one that was never legal. Filed as a mystery, the Robison's family becomes a puzzle. 6 silhouettes useful mainly for the question they leave behind. But there were people in that cottage. A man who 2 days before he died drove to the home of a grieving father and offered to pay for a boy's grave marker. 3 brothers, a mother, and a first grader who loved horses. They drove north for an ordinary summer, the way they had every year since 1957, and they were buried together that July. The parents' caskets were flanked by their 4 children before several hundred people. The man almost everyone believes killed them never spent a night in a cell. He spent those years in their offices instead. That far more than any missing weapon is the real unfinished business of the Robison's case. So here's the real question worth arguing in the comments. Standing in Donald Noggle's place in January of 1970, a 700-page report matched shell casings, a failed polygraph, and a clear motive on one side, and no recovered weapons and no fingerprints in the cottage on the other. Was declining to charge a defensible call about real evidentiary gaps a failure of nerve, or a decision driven by the cost of politics of a trial that size for a small county? Pick one and make your case for it. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, please feel free to leave it in the comments. And if this case held you, there is a companion piece on the channel that pairs with it well, the sealed farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck, another locked house that kept its answer far longer than it should have. It's on screen now. Hopefully, I'll see you there.